My name is Eric Wilfred Watson. I'm here to talk about Stephen King's latest release, You Like It Darker, his collection of stories. I just finished reading it, and I'd like to give you my mostly spoiler-free review. It's impossible to talk about these stories without giving at least a little bit away, but I'll try not to say anything that would take away from the reader's overall enjoyment of these works. Before I get into it, I want to talk briefly about Stephen King himself. Absolutely everyone who reads books knows who Stephen King is. They think he's great at crafting stories, creating interesting characters, and compelling situations. Other people think he's a hack and self-indulgent. Reality might be somewhere in between. Personally, I love Stephen King's books. One of the first books I ever read on my own accord as a teenager was The Dead Zone, and I've been a fan ever since. Stephen King is of the political left, which absolutely is his right, but that has alienated many people on the right who used to love Stephen King but can't tolerate his political opinions anymore. I'm not here to give my political opinions. However, the reason I mention this is because his politics have gotten into his books, and you should know that going in. This book has a little bit of his political opinions, but it is very mild. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think you could read this book and enjoy it. In my opinion, that shouldn't detract from your enjoyment of You Like It Darker. I think the stories stand very well on their own. The politics are very, very mild, almost non-existent in most of the stories. So let's get into it. I'm going to go through each story briefly and give you my thumbs up or thumbs down and let you know which of these stories are good, which of these stories are not so good, and why. The story opens up with two talented bastards, and bastards is spelled B-A-S-T-I-D-S, a stylized spelling of bastard. The reason that I like this story is because it is a very unique science fiction tale about an alien and how two struggling artists get their talent. It's very well written. Two characters go on a hunting trip, encounter strange goings-on in the woods. It reads very much like a pulpy science fiction story, but Stephen King has an excellent way of describing the alien. It's very interesting. The reason the aliens are here, very interesting. The character interaction, very interesting. It's also a tale of growing old and leaving behind a legacy after you die. And reading that knowing that Stephen King is 76 years old adds a layer of depth. I liked this story quite a bit. The next story, The Fifth Step, is probably my least favorite in this entire collection. In order for a story to work, there needs to be some kind of plot. Even in a short story, you need something to grab the reader. You need some sort of struggle. You need something to grasp onto. A sequence of events isn't really a story. I went to the store, I bought a gallon of milk, I got hit by a bus. That's not really a story. It's a sequence of events. You need conflict. You need something to struggle against, some sort of resolution. A string of events that culminate in a tragedy barely makes a story. This particular work is about a man who's going through the 12-step program as an addict and unburdens himself on a stranger on a bench. And it ends in a rather Stephen King kind of way, but I didn't care for the story. It just didn't really seem to have much of a point. The next story is also a thumbs down, Willie the Weirdo. It's about a kid who's obsessed with death and gruesomeness, a potential future serial killer. It's about his grandpa telling him gruesome stories and one of his siblings being grossed out by him, and it really seems like Stephen King was trying to make a deeper point but never quite got to the point. The story just doesn't do it for me. I give this one a solid thumbs down. The next story, however, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, might be one of my favorite Stephen King stories of all time. This story could almost have been a full-length novel. It has a compelling story arc. It has compelling characters. It's a wrong man thriller about a man who dreams about a dead body, only to find the dead body is actually there. And when he reports it to the police, he becomes really the only suspect in the case. It has a supernatural element, of course, because he dreamed something that he couldn't possibly have known about. It's about obsession and compulsion and what happens when somebody in power exercises that power in a terrifyingly unpleasant way. This book is fantastic. I don't want to give any of it away, but I hope they make a movie out of it. It's great. I love this story. It's my favorite in this entire collection. I highly recommend Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. If you don't read any other story in the book, purchase You Like It Darker for this story alone. It's excellent. I give it my absolute highest possible rating. The next story is called Finn. It takes place in Ireland. It's a case of mistaken identity. that involves torture and unpleasantness, and the story really doesn't go anywhere. It's rather pointless. I give it a thumbs down. The next story is called On Slide-In Road. It's a story about a grumbling, cranky family that's arguing during a road trip when they come across some people up to no good in the middle of nowhere. This story, I give a mild thumbs up. The character interaction is quite good. It does have a story worth reading. It's just not my favorite for reasons I can't quite put my thumb on. I just didn't care for this story, but I think a lot of Stephen King's readers would enjoy it, so I give it a mild thumbs up. The next story is called Red Screen, which I did not like. It's an amusing idea but doesn't really go anywhere, and it's another law enforcement story. Stephen King lately, in his later career, has written an awful lot of police-centric books, which is fine. As a matter of fact, I love them. The Bill Hodges trilogy is excellent. The Outsider is fantastic. I like Stephen King doing criminal justice-related stories. As a matter of fact, my own book, Judas Kissed, which you can purchase on Amazon.com, is a supernatural crime thriller. So if you want to support this channel, you can pick up my book, Judas Kissed, at Amazon.com. The next Stephen King story is The Turbulence Expert. I found this rather amusing. My brother works in the aviation industry, so a book about airplanes is something I'm always about. But aside from an interesting premise, again, the story doesn't really go anywhere. It's another shorter work, and Stephen King, I think, thrives on longer storytelling. When he only has a snapshot to give you an image, it's not as good as when he creates an entire landscape. I think the story is a little on the weak side, although rather amusing. I give it a mild thumbs up. The next story, Laurie, I give a thumbs up, although I didn't like the way it ended. It's the story about a man who's suffered a recent loss, who was given a puppy, and he begrudgingly becomes a fan of having a dog. I love this story because I love dogs, and it's a very interesting story about a man growing attached to a dog he didn't want, but the story takes a weird left turn, pointlessly, and ends in tragedy. Of course, it's a Stephen King book, and it's in a book called You Like It Darker, so bad things have to happen, but the bad thing that happens seems completely out of character with the rest of the story. It sort of left a sour taste in my mouth when it was over, but overall I think the story was quite enjoyable, so I'll give it a thumbs up. Rattlesnakes is an interesting story. It's a sequel to Cujo. Decades ago, his son died in the tragic events of the novel Cujo, and this shows him decades later in Florida, where he comes across a woman who's pushing a stroller, an empty stroller, because her twins died decades ago. It's a story about loss, it's a story about ghosts, it's a story that really has a supernatural element. Cujo was more of a thriller centered around a rabid dog, nothing particularly supernatural, but in this book, you really get into Stephen King's horror aspect. A lot of these stories I wouldn't really classify as horror. Rattlesnakes I would put firmly in the horror genre. I'm not a fan of books or stories that involve peril to children, especially dead children, so if that is a sensitive topic for you, you might want to skip Rattlesnakes, but this is a classic Stephen King horror story, and I would give it a thumbs up for that reason. The Dreamers is another story that I barely remember, even though I just read it. It didn't stick with me. I would give The Dreamers a thumbs down. The Answer Man is the closing story, and I like this one quite a bit. It's my second favorite story behind Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. The Answer Man is rather interesting because Stephen King took 45 years to write the story. He began writing it in the 70s, forgot about it, and came across it later and finished it. It doesn't read like a story written in two different chunks in two different decades, but it is. It's the story about a man who comes across a guy who can give you answers for money, and his answers are absolutely correct, but it has dark consequences. Again, if you don't like children in peril, this might not be the story for you, but I highly recommend The Answer Man. It's a very good story, and it's an excellent conclusion to his work of fiction here. Overall, even though this book has some weak stories, most of the stories are very good, and the good news is the longer stories are the better stories, and percentage-wise, not as much of the book. So overall, I think this is excellent. I don't think it's his best work of short fiction, but it's definitely an excellent book. I give it a very strong rating. And again, if you want to support this channel, you can purchase my novel, Judas Kissed, or Becoming Quincy on Amazon.com. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and you'll hear more book reviews in the future.